All right, so we are recording. Welcome everybody to this SUNY Innovative Instruction Technology Grant Program overview webinar. My name is Chris Price. I am the Academic Programs Manager for the SUNY Center for Professional Development. I've given you my email address for the IITG program there, rather than my SUNY email. You can get me directly if you just do chris.price@suny.edu. But if you have an IITG question, we request that you use that IITG email because there's some redundancy there. If I can't get to you, others might be able to. So if you have an IITG question, use that. It gets forwarded to me and I'll just reply to you from my own address, my own email address. The plan for this webinar today is, to do a few things. There's a lot packed into this. So in the first couple parts, I'll give you a brief overview of what the IITG program is all about, its history since 2012. That'll be pretty quick. And then we'll spend some time talking about the elements of a strong proposal. So there's a bunch of slides on that. And then I've invited two members of our Innovative Instruction Research Council, the IIRC, who oversee the IITG program, to be here to share their thoughts about what a strong proposal looks like. So you'll hear from them about halfway. And then, we'll get into some of the details around what you need to do to submit an application. So I have some screenshots in the presentation that show you what the application portal looks like. And then whatever time is left, we'll use for Q&A. I'm happy to stay here past the hour. So if you have a question and it doesn't get answered within the hour, I'll stick around until you have to leave. So I'll be here past the hour. And then, as I said before, we will share the recording with this with everybody on the website. We'll email it to you, but also post it on the website. Where the application materials are for the program. Before I get started, I'd like to invite anyone that attends here to sign up to be a reviewer. All of the IITG proposals are peer-reviewed before they are reviewed totally by the IIRC. IRC basically takes a look at all the peer reviews and then makes recommendations to the provost for what to fund for the program. And so there's a button on the homepage of the IITG website down in the lower right-hand corner. I've highlighted it there. And you can sign up by clicking on that Learn More button to become a reviewer. We assign approximately, as it says there, 48 proposals per person to review. And then, we've gotten feedback that it takes about 4 to 8 hours total to review proposals, about an hour a proposal, essentially. And we don't send out any, we don't ask you to review proposals from your campus. So we make sure we align, make that alignment, or don't assign your proposals from your campus. But we also ask you to, in the application, to be a reviewer, sort of indicate what areas you'd be comfortable reviewing. So please go ahead and sign up. The more reviewers we get, the more peer reviews we can do, and the better we're able to get you feedback about your proposal, whether it's funded or not. So let's start out with what IITG is. These 6 bullets, I think, sum it up pretty nicely. And the idea behind IITG, it was created in 2012. Its first year was 2012, when there was a real strong attempt to sort of make bridges across campuses to replicate things that are going well on one campus with other campuses within SUNY. And like I said, transcend campus boundaries, but also build communities of practice across campuses throughout SUNY. And the other thing about IITG you should know is that there is a strong emphasis on evidence of success. Obviously, you want to know if something's successful, if you're going to adopt a project. So we have a pretty robust assessment component to IITG. And ultimately, what it's meant to do is leverage technology to support SUNY strategic priorities. and then, like I said, scale up the successful IITG projects across SUNY. So the idea is to really facilitate sharing and collaboration across the system. So most, not all, but most IITGs have a significant collaborative component. They involve more than just one instructor or one staff member in one department in their project. Many of them involve collaborations across campuses. And as I say there in the second bullet, the higher the funding request for the program, the greater their expectation there is for collaboration, not only across departments within a campus, but across campuses as well. So, proposals that are perceived to have sort of limited value to a single campus without a plan to share or scale their results usually do not rank well when they are reviewed. So here's just a list of projects that have been funded and very successful projects across the years since 2012. Many of you probably have heard of at least one or more of these. The Open Educational Resources Department, and all the things we've done with OER throughout SUNY really got their start with IITG. MOOCs as well, and there, you could read the slide, you see what's there. More recently, we've been working on funding tools for HyFlex and large courses. I'll say more about that in a minute. So here's just a history of what the funding has looked like. So over $5.5 million of funds have been distributed since 2012. And it's a relatively competitive program. In 2019, we only funded 30% of the proposals that were submitted. It's been a pretty wide range of number of proposals, but we typically get anywhere from, you could see 45 in 2015. The first year had 117, but we expect, since there's been a break in the program for a while, to get a significant number of proposals. So to have your proposal stand out, you'll need to really pay attention to the next section where we talk about elements of a quality proposal. So as I mentioned, the IITG program was suspended in 2020. You could obviously guess why that was the case. And again, one thing, I'll just ask you to please mute your you can pretty much guess why it was paused in 2020. We did have a call for proposals that year. We had the full peer review. The IIRC made its recommendations to the provost. And then, in the midst of the pandemic and the budget crisis that caused in New York State, unfortunately, we were forced to sort of cancel the round of funding for that year. However, last year, kind of late in the year, we did learn that we had access to some funds. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to put out an RFP to the campuses. So we identified two projects in SUNY system to fund in 2022. And we put out a call for participants in these two projects. One is looking at video conferencing tools for HyFlex courses, and we have about 55 faculty from across SUNY participating in that project. And then one that is looking at software tools to teach large courses, and we have about 30 faculty participating in that project. So we're halfway through. Those are currently going on this academic year, and we'll have lots of reports and research results to share with SUNY later this semester, particularly at the CIT conference in late May. All right, so that's the history of IITG. Like I said, I wanted to be quick with that. Next, we're just going to go into what a strong IITG proposal looks like. Like I said, the program is pretty competitive, so your proposal really needs to be strong to be considered. And you'll see that what I go over here lines up really nicely with what's in the RFP that was sent out last month. So let's just start first with innovation, right? You need to have an innovative idea. It's an innovative, instruction program, right? However, we recognize that innovation is not something that, you can kind of conceive of in a vacuum. There's really not, innovation means, novel, new things, right? But it really is kind of dependent upon your context, what innovation means and what your project and how your project is innovative. So a few years ago, the IIRC came up with these 4 definitions of innovation to sort of recognize that some projects are innovative in different ways. So, there isn't really a direct kind of correlation between the amount of funding you get and these different types of definitions of innovation. But that basic definition you see there is typically one will be used to identify projects that are smaller scale, that have a smaller dollar amount total ask. And, for low stakes things, test ideas in single courses or programs. Sustaining innovation, kind of may look at solutions to problems that are somewhat well-defined. They're not, brand new ideas, but, they haven't really been widely adopted across maybe SUNY or in general. And so sustaining innovation kind of recognizes that sometimes good ideas just need more help kind of scaling beyond individual use cases. Breakthrough innovation, these are our pervasive educational challenges and ideas that seek to address our pervasive educational challenges that you all find in your campuses. Enrollment comes to mind as one, right? Or completion, program completion, that sort of thing. How can you, utilize technology to address those pervasive educational challenges? And then finally, disruptive innovation is the sort of classic textbook definition of innovation that you often will hear, and that is the sort of projects that seek to employ creative solutions to the most intractable and hard to address educational challenges, ideas that kind of upend everything, and really try to shake the tree and really create some change. Now, we recognize that IITG, most projects or many projects will not have this kind of a definition of innovation, but we certainly welcome those of you that are really thinking along these lines. So the other thing you have to do is not just have an innovative idea, but it needs to align with SUNY strategic priorities. And we have those listed. This is straight from the RFP. You'll notice with these strategic priorities that they are pretty broad. There is first, the FAC2 Council, so that's the Faculty Advisory Council for Teaching and Technology, ultimately was the original committee that developed or oversaw the IITG program before the IIRC took it on. And so it is the committee within SUNY that addresses technology and teaching. And so we thought it would be good if folks can look at the 2 recent task groups that are part of that committee, leveraging the DLE and inclusive pedagogy. So the DLE is the distance learning environment, which really references the new Brightspace LMS that many of you, most of you throughout SUNY will be transitioning to if you haven't already. And so this committee, this task group is looking at how can we leverage this new digital learning environment, not distance learning environment, this new digital learning environment to do things that we couldn't do before. All these connections that are now happening across campuses where students can log in, and they're on multiple campuses, they can see all their courses in one LMS. So, and there's lots of opportunities that this committee is looking into to leverage the learning objects repository that hopefully we can have access to in Brightspace. And so there are lots of great ideas there that we can maybe fund through IITG. And then the inclusive pedagogy task group for FAC2 started their work last year, and they're continuing in this academic year. And they're looking for SUNY examples of inclusive pedagogy where we can leverage technology to share those across the system. So, and that second bullet really reemphasizes the commitment that we have in SUNY to diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. It's a high priority on all of our campuses to make sure that our courses, our programs, the way instructors teach services for students are inclusive and recognize the diversity of students that go to SUNY schools. The last three bullets talk a lot about, in particular challenges that many campuses face, trying to address workforce needs, to trying to address students' needs to be ready to work, ready for careers, and in many ways that involves micro-credentials, certificates, degrees that are very targeted on the needs of New York State and the workforce needs of New York State. And then we also know that we have a lot of students on our campuses who are non-traditional, we used to call them, but non-traditional. Many campuses are the traditional students that work full-time, have families, and that are really looking for ways to complete their education that are innovative, different, taking into account the fact that they have other things going on in their lives, right? And then finally, that last bullet is kind of the catch-all bullet, the things that we're all trying to do: improve student learning, student success, and program completion. We want to make sure we not only admit our students who we think will be successful, but also do those things to hopefully lead to their success once they get on our campuses. So if you have an innovative idea and it aligns with SUNY strategic priorities, then we get into the proposal, right? And one thing actually I'll say too, I meant to say this earlier on the slide about innovative ideas, is that on the website, you'll find a list of all the prior projects, and it is searchable. So it's searchable by certain keywords and areas, but also just searchable in general with an open search. So, once you've, done some thinking about what you might want to propose, I recommend that you go there as well to just make sure that it hasn't been done already. And so if it has been and you think you want to take it into a different direction, you can always feel free to, reach out to us to see if that makes sense. But once you've come up with that idea, once you've figured out how it aligns with SUNY strategic priorities, then you really have to kind of come up with the details of your project, a clear narrative, objectives, timeline, assessment, and communication plan. Like I said, assessment is a really important component of IITG. We want to know how it went, and we want you to be able to communicate that to the SUNY community. There's also a section of the application, which I'll go over later, that asks for a budget narrative and also for you to itemize what you're going to be spending your funds on if you're awarded an IITG. So you have to think about, like, okay, you have a good idea, but how are you going to use funds to support that idea? And then, like I said, it has to have potential to be replicated, shared, and scaled throughout SUNY. We also want to know that your campus supports it, right? Your campus needs to have some skin in the game, so to speak, especially for those proposals that have more, where you're asking for more than $15,000. And so there is as the next slide will show, a cost sharing requirement for proposals that are more than $15,000. And this is, those of you familiar with the program, in the past, we had different tiers. There used to be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 1 had no cost share. Tier 2 had some cost share, and then 3 had the most cost share. We've kind of done away with the tiers, but we've maintained the cost share requirements for proposals that ask for more money. So next slide, and you'll see what that looks like. So like I said, up to $15,000, your campus does not need to cover any costs beyond that. If you're asking for more than 15, but up to 30, we request a 25% campus cost share. And then between over 30, but up to 60, 50% of your budget needs to be shared in cost. And they could be in-kind costs, they could be payments directly to the project from your campus. But like I said, we just want to make sure that the higher they ask, the more your campus is on board with the idea and the project itself. So the other thing to note too is the cost share is on top of the request. So for example, if you're requesting $30,000, the cost share requirement is $7,500. All right, and then anything over 30 up to 60. So if you ask for $60,000, the cost share requirement is $30,000 for a total budget of $90,000. So whatever you can ask for up to 60, but if you do that, you have to, again, over $15,000, you'll have to indicate the cost share and what that's going to look like. And I'll show you later an example of what I'll show you the budget spreadsheet and how you'll indicate your cost sharing items in your budget. So the other thing I really want to emphasize, especially, is that you have to, if you're all proposals, not even those that are require cost share, but all proposals require endorsement by a named senior level campus officer. Could be a provost, could be a vice president, a dean, somebody that, who's authorized to allocate resources. Oh, sorry. Allocate resources on your campus. I actually heard from a provost on a campus recently, I won't say who it was, who reached out to me and said, can you please make sure you communicate this? We've had instances where faculty were applying for grants like this and not and committing resources for the campus and not getting permission to to have those resources allocated to their project. So while this is a project that is ideal because it allows individual faculty, individual staff to come up with an idea on their own, it doesn't mean you can just totally go on it on your own. You have to work with folks and get permission from administrators to make sure that it's something that the campus will support for you to do. All right. So I'm just going to turn it over to my colleagues, Sue Deer and Nicola Elaine. Sue's she's the officer in charge at Rockland Community College, and Nicola is dean at School of Arts and Humanities at Empire State College. They've both been on the IRC for a while, and I just thought it would be great for you to hear from someone other than me and folks that actually work on campuses to hear their thoughts about what a strong IITG proposal looks like. Now, like I said, I'll just say it again. The IRC looks at all the applications. The peer review happens. Folks get like anywhere from 3 to 6 proposals for the peer review, but then the IRC looks at all the proposals, all the peer reviews, and makes those recommendations to the provost. So they have that bird's eye view of what proposals look like, what we've gotten over the years, and what the ones that sort of rise to the top look like. So Sue and Nicola, could you please tell us what you look for when you're reviewing IITG proposals? What are some tips you'd give those as they think about their ideas for IITG funds and write their proposal? And then what are some common pitfalls they should avoid? So,
Chris, when I was thinking about this, I thought to myself, first of all, how long have I been on the IRC? And it's got to be since 2013, because I remember reading all 93 of those proposals. And that's what everybody needs to realize. We read 93 of the proposals plus, all right, what the reviewers have to say, and it takes a lot of time. But some of the things that I've heard across the table over the last couple of years is we're not going to fund something that should be funded by your institution. For example, if you want to increase your computer lab and you want to add 5 computers and you're going after a grant for that, that's not going to score very high at all if it scores anything. So keep in mind, you won't fund something, all right, that's funded by or needs to be funded by the institution. The other thing is, don't assume, all right, when we're reading your grant that we understand what you're saying. Okay, I'd rather have you as a reviewer, as a part of this council, I'd rather have you say, assume that I don't know anything. It needs to be very clear, very concise. Don't use acronyms that we can't figure out. All right, try to make it as simple as possible. And almost write your grant like, we don't have any idea what you're doing, and you really need to explain it to us from square one. And that would be very helpful. I've also heard over the years that, people who are looking at these grants feel it's not reasonable, the implementation, the timeline. So make sure that it is something that is reasonable. I probably hear most about being innovative. It's not innovative. How is this innovative? So one of the things that you can do is, if you think it's innovative, all right, tell us how it's innovative, because we may not get that. All right. So if you say this is innovative, blah, 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 then it's right in front of our eyes. Okay, and that's really, really important. I think Chris mentioned this, but it's not a one and done type of a thing. What we're looking for is something that's scalable, either internally or across SUNY, so that can be, sustainable and replicated. When you read the instructions, all right, pay attention to the fact that, and Chris mentioned this, a guiding assumption at this funding level, which is $15,000 to $30,000, okay, is that collaboration with other faculty, departments, and schools is not required but encouraged. Even though it's not required, some people say, okay, I don't have to do it, all right? The partnerships and relationships with others is really going to help you with your score. In the past, some of the things that we looked at, the drones, we had one year, Chris, I don't know if you remember, we had so many proposals on drones and MOOCs, when MOOCs was really big, the OER, the badging, virtual reality, those were kind of really cool, and also micro-credentialing. But, as we move forward, especially after the pandemic, we are looking at things like OER. DEI is something that really needs to be incorporated in your proposal, even high flex, because most of us have gone, that route. What can you do innovatively? And, even lumen circles, include that in your proposal. And I think, you really need to look at the fact that, remember, this is an innovative instructional technology grant, instructional technology. Keep that in mind as you think in your proposals. The other thing that I think people forget in their proposals, and I've heard this across the table a lot, is how are you going to assess it? And that's really important. A lot of people leave that out. So make sure that you put an assessment plan in your proposal. And a lot of reviewers comment on that. This person, submitted this proposal, it's a great proposal, but there's no assessment. So that's really the suggestions I would have. I wanted to keep it simple. And Nicole, you may want to add to that as well.
Thanks so much, Sue. Happy New Year, everyone. Glad to see you here. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Chris, for hosting. And I'm delighted to join you and appreciate the invitation. So I agree with everything that Sue had said. These were all things, of course, that are preliminary things I would have thought about. Now, the next level of the kinds of, both expectations and discussions can be divided into two buckets. The first bucket is really, what does your proposal need to include and cover? And Chris went through that carefully, but I can't emphasize enough the fact that you really want to look at what are the elements that the committee is going to be reviewing and make sure you cover them, because they're on a rubric and the rubric is rated, and you might do great on almost all points, but you miss a point, such as assessment, such as how will this scale or how will this be shared, and get 0 for that because there's nothing there. And if there's a 0 for that, even if you have the most innovative, creative, fantastic idea, your proposal would be downgraded and possibly not even meet the top cut because you missed the required elements. So take a look at those, make sure you cover all of the areas. One thing in addition to assessment that seems to be missed is, scalability. Like, how will it scale? Spend a paragraph thinking that through. And also, how are you going to share this? How can it be replicated across other programs, across other institutions? Those are important points. Even if you don't really, have a plan or know how to do this, think carefully about it and propose something and address those elements, right? So that's the first bucket. Now, the second bucket is really, how do you get to innovation and what is it? Chris presented the various definitions, because that must be, I think, every single meeting that we do when we gather as a council, a research council, to really think this through. We start the conversation with, what is innovation today? Like, what does it mean now? Because some of the things that would have been perfectly innovative 7 years ago may now be widely adopted, not just across SUNY, but across higher education. So you really want to think about what's innovative. And as you do that, do your due diligence. Take Chris's suggestion to go and review some of the things that have been funded. We do tend to see trends, as Sue pointed out. Some things are super trendy one year. Drones, everybody wants them. Or, the MOOCs came out, so everybody was proposing for MOOCs. It's not a bad thing to be working on the newest thing that everyone is talking about. It is better to be doing a couple of things. One might be working a little bit ahead of that curve, right? So really looking at what isn't just in the sort of mass media and public mind now, but what will be coming, right? So that you can really be proposing something that's truly ahead of the pack. And the other thing is really that innovation doesn't necessarily have to be technological. In our case, we're really looking at, pedagogical and student service improvements, really, large scale or small scale curricular changes that can really make a difference in the learning process and in student success. So when you do that, that could mean that it's really something that's relevant, not so much to what's happening in the larger field in higher education, but what's relevant to your discipline, what's relevant to the pedagogical practices of your learners. So really thinking about that approach as well. So, in addition to really looking at, what's been done previously and do all your due diligence and environmental scanning, as Sue pointed out, clearly define the scope of your project, because that's really important. And make sure that you consult with the stakeholders. If you're going to include people, other programs, collaborators in your proposal, make sure they know that and that they've been a part of the conversation from the beginning, because we have encountered over the years sometimes where it's clear that there's a disconnect happening there. And a couple of the don'ts that I have are really, we have seen sometimes where there's something proposed in which a package is being purchased from a vendor, and it's a combination of, let's say, goods and services. It's a software plus the services, but in which the primary benefit of the expense on the funding and the grant would go to the vendor and not necessarily to the institution, to the students, to the faculty, to everyone who's involved. So I would recommend that you avoid those scenarios, but that really you think deeply about, what innovation are we trying to accomplish? When can we reach out and collaborate with the people across your programs, your school, across your college and other colleges even, who are the experts that will work closely with you and be willing to embark on this journey with you. I would say don't be afraid to be just creative and to look at discovery and experimentation. We're always delighted when we see something that comes through that really has that creative discovery experimentation bent that's a good fit for the project that is proposed. We really do love those. And of course, as an arts and humanities person, I do have to say that we tend to see a lot of proposals that come in from certain fields. And not as many that come in from wider fields, including arts and humanities, but also more of the social and behavioral sciences. And we do see a lot, let's say, in health sciences, nursing, but not as many in some of the other fields. So I would definitely encourage that if you're thinking of doing something that's in a field that might be outside of the bucket where we normally think innovation of this type happens, or that may or may not be funded, please be creative, be experimental, go ahead with your proposal. We have seen some incredibly creative proposals for things that would be done through museums, in music, in the arts and other areas, as well as all of the professionally oriented ones that we have seen. So I will stop there. I hope you found that to be helpful.
Thank you, Nicola and Sue. That was really helpful. And I just want to sort of second something that you just said, Nicola, and that is, while you can request money for vendors in your budget, but like she said, I think it shouldn't just be seen as an attempt to just, find funding to pay a vendor to do a thing, right? There really needs to be that careful consideration for how the funding will benefit the campus, benefit the project, benefit SUNY. And I got a couple questions in the chat about, whether or not the project would be appropriate for a project that has international partners or a project that has community partners. And my answer to both is definitely maybe. The question always is it is the primary beneficiary of the project, your campus and SUNY in general. The only limits you'll have on what you can spend funds on are the same limits that, and those of you that work at the four-year state-operated campuses know this, the same limits that we have on any New York State funds that we spend in our budgets. So, and I'll talk a little bit about this more shortly, but the only limits we have on spending, and I say only kind of in quotes, because those of you that deal with state purchasing things know that this is not always easy to spend state funds, but those are the limits of this program. Because they are state dollars, you can spend money on anything that you can spend money on with state dollars in another state account that you have. The same holds for those on the community college campuses, but the way we spend it just is a little bit different, but the same limitations apply as well. So I'm just going to address this question and then I'll move on, but the CFP mentions furniture or tech to support a classroom as ineligible. So this include projects to outflow classroom and furniture tech enable innovative way. So yeah, so that I think the answer to this question, and again, Chris, it's going to be relative, right? So if the whole project budget is for that classroom tech, then it's highly unlikely to be funded. There needs to be kind of a balance there. I mean, it's the purpose isn't to sort of figure out a creative way to justify redesigning a classroom with innovative technology. The purpose of the project is to kind of come up with an idea that yes, if this is what you need to fund that idea, great. But if it's the whole budget, it's highly unlikely it would be funded, because the reviewers and the IRC will probably interpret it as just a way to get funding to renovate a classroom. All right, so we're about a little over 20 minutes left. So like I said, I do want to, you could continue to put questions in the chat, but I definitely want to make sure those of you that have to leave at 1 benefit from me going over what you need to put into your proposal and how to go about doing that. And like I said, I'm willing to stick around after 1 to answer any outstanding questions. So got through the elements of the strong proposal. Now we're going to work on the application process. And so the website is there. We just transitioned to a new website. So if you actually search IITG on Google, it might bring you our old website. But I believe we're redirecting now to the new one. So this is what it looks like on the homepage. So hopefully this is, if you see anything other than this on the homepage, then you're at the wrong spot. So make sure, and you can get to it through that redirect, that suny.edu/IITG, that will always bring you here. And you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, there's an apply button, and you'll go there. This page is the apply page on the website, has everything that you need. You'll see, if you go there now, you'll actually see the slide deck from today there down next to where the says the informational webinar, and then I'll put the link to the recording there as well. The proposal, to submit a proposal, you'll have to go through the IITG online application portal. So we use this program, it's called Foundant, but it doesn't really matter what the name is to you. It's just a place that SUNY has for submitting proposals like this, and we've been using Foundant for quite a while for this program. So first, the RFP is listed. Make sure you look over the RFP, have that in hand. Once you feel pretty confident that you have what is needed on the RFP, you can go into that portal. There's also a quick start guide for the portal. Pretty much repeats everything that I'm saying here, but it may be helpful for you to take a look at once again before you actually go into the portal. So when you get there, you'll see this logon screen. So if you applied for IITG before, or if you've served as a peer reviewer before, you probably have an account here already. So, and it's probably been a few years. And so if you don't remember your password, there's a forgot your password a tool there. But I would recommend you log in first with your SUNY email. And then, if you don't remember your password, do the forgot your password. But if you're brand new to all this, you just create a new account there. It'll ask you for some just basic contact information. I think there's some required fields, but you don't have to fill out the non-required fields. So once you do that, you'll see an apply button at the top. And the bottom, you'll see any active requests. So when you log back in, you'll see an active request that you have out there. You'll see historical requests. If you've applied for IITG before, or if either you're funded or non-funded, you'll see them there as well. So once you hit that apply button at the top, you're going to come to this application page screen. Now, we do share this system with other offices within SUNY System Administration. And I do believe there's another application in there right now other than IITG. So all this means is that you just have to make sure that you're applying to the IITG. And like I said, there won't be more than 3 in there. Our contract with this company that does this only allows us to have 3 open applications at one time. Maybe it's 5. Anyway, there won't be like a big long list. You'll be able to see IITG pretty clearly when you get to that page. You also have the option to actually preview the application before applying. So while I will show you many of the sections within the application in the next few slides, if you want to get that full preview of what the application looks like without actually starting an application, you could do that there. You'll also have the opportunity to, once you hit that apply button, to print out a question list in a PDF. So I highly recommend you do that. And that way you can kind of have all the questions on a PDF. You can, answer them outside of the system. And then when you are ready to put them in the system, you have everything in a separate doc, and it's just a copy and paste situation. So once you log into there, let me go back. Once you hit that begin application, you'll come to this field. Actually, it's below that. Once you hit that apply, it brought you here. And this is just the top of the screen. The bottom of the screen looks like this. I've collapsed all the sections, but if you hit the carrots on the left-hand side, it'll bring you up to, accordion the sections so you could see what's in each section. But these are all the sections. There is that contact information for persons submitting the application. So now, some of you may have someone submitting it who's not going to be the principal investigator for the project, the PI. So if that's the case, you can just make sure that, when you click on that principal investigator section, that you put that person who's filling it out puts your information in that section. If the PI is the person who's filling it out, then you don't have to put that information in twice. So here's that first section, the PI, project lead collaborator section. And there are some character limits to sections. Some questions require you type into a box. Some require you to upload a document. Others give you a choice. You could upload Word docs, Excel docs. Everything's automatically converted to a PDF on the back end of the system. If you have collaborators, this is an example of a question where you can do either. If you have just one collaborator, you could put that person's name in the box there. But if you have multiple collaborators, you could put them all in one doc and upload a file. So here's what I was talking about before about the endorsement of campus support. Again, you make sure you have that named person listed here. So as I said in the text, in the chat, my response in the chat, you don't have to have a letter from that person. You just have to put their name and their contact information. The name's just actually their name and title of that person. We actually ask it later in the document for your provost's name and email as well. But if that person's not the provost, the person who's signing off on especially again, for those that are asking for funding that requires a cost share, that person's name is there. And if you put that person's name there, we'll assume that you have approval from that person to do this project. And should you get funding, that they're going to commit those resources to the project. Letters of support are optional. So you can get a letter of support from that person. The reviewers will see that. You can letters of support from collaborators, from vendors, from others. The only thing with letters of support is if you have letters of support, there isn't any limit, but if you include 10 letters of support, it's highly unlikely that the reviewers are going to read those carefully if you have 10 letters. So my recommendation is, think carefully about what letters of support you want to include that will improve your application. And you have to put them all in one file. It won't allow you to upload multiple letters. You just have to kind of put them all in one PDF, scan them together, or use Acrobat to merge them together, and then you upload that file there. All right, so that was the principal investigator and project lead section. I skipped over the project summary section. That's basically just a short abstract of your project that we'll use on the website should it be funded. But a lot of other things are going to be in this next section, this project information section. Now, this is the heart of your proposal here, the innovative instruction project narrative. So this is where everything goes, but it's 2 pages. So you have to think carefully about, what you want to include in this section. You can use graphs, pictures, etc., but it should all fit on 2 pages. So just again, think very carefully about how you want to describe your project. There are separate sections for you to put in your communications and assessment plan and your project objectives. So you don't have to list all those here. Really, you're just describing your project, like what it is you'll do for your IITG project. So that it says it's indicated these funds are used for a planning grant. Basically, that's if you're asking for maybe just a lower amount of funding with the expectation that you want to approve proof of concept, that maybe will lead to a subsequent application in a subsequent year to ask for more funds. You just have to sort of indicate that here as well. There's no separate category for this, but if that's the approach you want to take, because this is a 1-year program that you think this project might require more than 1 year, think about it that way. Okay, the first year I'm going to ask for some planning funds in the anticipation that I'll learn something, and then scale it up a little larger and ask for more funds in a subsequent year if this is funding. The other thing we ask you to do is categorize your project according to these categories in this CAPE matrix. I won't go into detail about what that is here, but the next screen kind of shows you the categories that we have in that matrix. So these 8 categories, you'll have to select at least 1, but up to 3 to categorize your project. And we use these. If you go to the website, you'll see you can search projects in these larger categories over the years. Other items in this section, as I mentioned before, we want you to have 3 learning outcomes, project outcomes, expected outcomes for the project. You'll have to upload a timeline, what the project's going to look like and what kind of return on effort invested you'll get. And then last, there's the assessment and communication plan narrative. Both those last 2 things are only about a page. Again, we're not asking for that much because reviewers, we want reviewers to be able to do it in a timely fashion. So you'll have to really be concise and very economical in how you do these things. The one thing, actually, I want to go back to that page for a second. The one thing I will say here, I don't think it's on another slide, is that in terms of communicating and sharing what you do for your project, the project requires that any product of it, have a Creative Commons license. So we typically tell folks that if you're proposing a commercial product as part of this project, this might not be the ideal grant for you, because whatever is produced as part of IITG funding needs to have that Creative Commons license. And so, that if it's something that you'll want copyrighted or patented, that might not be compatible. That said, we certainly have had projects in the past that utilized commercial partners or vendors and this sort of thing. So there can be ways around it, but if the sole purpose is to create something that's commercially commercial product, this is probably not the program for you. But just reach out to me and we can talk about it if you're not sure. And then the final section of the proposal that I wanted to go over is the budget administrative support section. So the money, the money part of the application, and this section is in. Sorry. The head. Sections in 2 parts. There's the narrative part, so where you kind of describe how you're going to use your funds. Okay. And again, this is another 1 page of less section. And then, you'll talk about what you put in your budget. And then there is a section to put in something to justify a funding cap exception. So the most projects are, you can't ask for more than $60,000. We've had very few exceptions to this, but if there is a good reason for why you think your proposal should be exempt from that funding cap, you can certainly ask. And so here's where you would do that. And then the other piece to other than the narrative is the budget worksheet. Now there's a link to the budget worksheet here in the proposal. If you go to the apply website, you'll see the link to that worksheet there as well. And so you'll probably want to work on that simultaneously with working on the narrative. The narrative that says there tells the story, and there's a little brief rationale for each item in the budget, but the narrative itself should kind of, connect the dots between all the things that you're asking for funding for. And you have to use this budget worksheet. If you do not use this budget worksheet, your proposal won't be reviewed. So you have to use that one. You can't use the substitute one. We need everybody to use the same worksheet. And the other thing is a text box at the end here. Because these are New York State funds, because they will be utilizing 2023, 2024 funds, there's very strict deadlines of when you can spend those funds. So they have to be expended or encumbered by June 30th, 2024. We can't roll over funds. You have to apply again for another project if you have something that you think needs to go past 2 years. Your budget wouldn't roll over in that case. You'd just basically be awarded a new for a new project. So we ask you to just clarify that you understand that in the application, that there really is no in no case will your funding be rolled over to another year. It's you have to spend it all in that year, use it or lose it. This is what that spreadsheet looks like. You can see the green section are the funding requests one, and then the campus match. And like I said, it's on top of the cost share is on top of the total amount that you're asking for. So, if, like I said, if you're asking for $60,000, the total should come up to 60 in the green column and then 30 in the yellow column. There are two sections, and this is just kind of the way New York State budgets work or state budgets work. There's personnel sections of your budget, and then there's other than personnel OTPS section of your budget. And so there's no requirement that you have certain percentage in either or. I mean, if it's all heavily in personnel or all heavily in OTPS, that's definitely going to get scrutiny. So there should be some kind of probably a balance between the two, but there may be good reasons why there's not. But you again make the case for that in your budget narrative. Again, some other sort of funding things that I just want to go over here quickly. These are state funds, so it goes through the normal departmental process that you'd go through with any state funds. This is the PI. You would be required to keep track of the budget, and then if you can make changes in your budget after you're awarded it, you just can't move without permission more than 20% from one of those category, one of the personnel category to the OTPS category. So you can't take more than 20% out of one category, put it in another one without permission. But you can move money around within categories without permission. But anything significantly moving funds more than 20% out of one to another, you just have to check with IIT administration, just to get approval to do that. We do audits. We try to make sure that you're following state rules for purchasing. Incentives are really tricky with state dollars. You can't do a lot of stuff around incentives. You can't, I can't give away laptops. You can't give away iPads. You can't have random games of chance like drawings, lotteries, things like that as incentives for projects. If a vendor supplies that stuff in kind, that's fine. But the state dollars can't be used to say drawing for a gift card or something like that. A lot of times what our awardees will do is provide travel to CIT or pay for CPD points, Center for Professional Development points, for events like CIT as an incentive for folks if you're not going to pay them as a project participant. We're here to help, so just reach out. I know budgets can be confusing. And there's a whole section in the FAQ with budget questions. So I just want to highlight that. Make sure you look at that before you ask questions. There is no overhead. I just want to point out too, these funds are state funds. So they don't go through the Research Foundation. There's basically an account is set up that you will draw upon. And so these aren't RF funds. And so there's no overhead or anything like that. There is, for folks on community college campuses, there is some option, and one of the FAQ questions address this for setting aside funds for processing at a community college level, if that's something that you need to account for, but not at the state campus, because basically you just get an account that you draw on. And then finally, after you're all done figuring out all that budget stuff, there's just a list of everybody that needs to kind of sign off and people that we need to be able to contact with. You know, someone that deals with state purchase requests, we need to know who they are to loop them in the process, your chief academic officer. And then, like I said, even though you don't need this to go through the RF on your campus, we do ask for your grants administration officer, and some campuses require that person sign off on the IITG, your grants person on your campus. So, you know, check with that person on your campus if they need to sign off. Either way, we want their name on the application in case they need to be looped into anything. All right, and then once you give all that information, you submit your application, make sure you save along the way. You can abandon your request if you decide, yeah, I'm not going to do this after you start to put it in, but then it gets archived. So we request you do that if you decide that after you've filled out some stuff, you don't want to do it anymore. All right, and here's the timeline. So proposals are due a month from today, about 11:15 by 11:59 in that system. And we have the peer review, and then the IRC review, and then we make our recommendations by the end of April to the provost. The provost either accepts or modifies those recommendations, and then we hope to get you notified by May 8th whether or not you received a grant, and then we typically try to get that before the SUNY CIT conference so that we can announce who's been funded at that conference at the end of May. And then we set you up in the system with accounts to draw on for your project in June, and then you start doing your project as early as like June 15th. And then, like I said, all funds must be expended or encumbered by June 30th. All right, and this is basically just a summary slide. Email IITG grants if you have questions, check the FAQs. You're responsible for forwarding information to co-PIs. We're only going to communicate with the person who's listed as the co-PI, the PI in the application. So if you have co-PIs, you have to make sure you loop them into any communication that you get from us. And like I said, everything's due 17th at 11:59. Become a reviewer if you aren't already. I mentioned that earlier. Just want to reinforce that. And yes, we are onto questions. Now, I knew this is going to run out of time, so I apologize if you have to run at one, but I'm just going to go ahead and start looking in the chat at the questions. So, all right. So I'm looking at Christina's question. Do all SUNY faculty need to submit directly? Our campus has an Office of Sponsored Programs. I'm not sure it would be us or them who submit the application to the portal. So yes, faculty and staff submit. The person who, well, I'll correct myself there. If you want the person from your Office of Sponsored Programs to submit, that's totally fine. They'll just put their contact information in the section, the very first section that says contact information of the person submitting. And then in the second section, there's a spot to put the PI. So that's up to your campus. So yes, you certainly could do it that way if that's your campus policy, but certainly faculty and staff can just submit directly. Main narrative, yes, is 2 pages. How smooth are the funds transmission to four-year and graduate program schools? Simone, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that question. Are you still here?
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yo, I was just curious because I know with the current round of the SUNY HighFlex project that those seem to have a delay. So I was just curious if we had, for example, students or other folks who may not be so understanding if things are delayed. I was just curious if it's the same process.
Yeah, one of the issues with the way we did it this year in the project, now Simone's referring to the tools for HighFlex project, she's one of the project participants, is that we are administering the funds in system to the campuses. The difference now with this is that basically those of you on the four-year campuses will get a state account number for your project, and you'll just basically draw from that account, and you'll be able to spend on that account just like you would any other state account you have in your campus. So there's really no go-between. So they're smoother. It'll be a lot smoother. It's, you know, the reason why we're going back to the RFP process, frankly, because it makes it a lot easier for campuses to just kind of follow their procedures for spending state funds. And so definitely smoother.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris.
Sure. Oh, geez. Huh. So I believe both of those questions, both of those email addresses go to the same place. That is, wow, good catch. Thank you, Casey. You know, if there's any issue, you can just email me. I'll put my email address in the chat. But I think those two are the same. They both go to the same place. But I know for certain the IITG grants one is the one that I get the emails from. So, geez. Good catch. Thank you, sir. All right. Next one. Would you please confirm whether the budget categories you referenced relating to the 20% approval requirement for moving funds are solely personal and OTPS? Those two and not budget categories versus travel versus supplies. Right. Exactly. So within each of those categories, you can, for whatever you propose, you can move around the money however you want without permission. The only time you need approval is if you want to go from the big bucket of personnel to OTPS, which is everything else, or the other way around from OTPS to personnel. If you want to move more than 20% of what you had budgeted for either of those categories into the other category, that's when we need to talk. But you can move things around on other things. Again, as long as you're following you know, a couple things, as long as you're following state purchasing guidelines, and as long as you're basically doing what you propose to do in your project, right? Like if all of a sudden you're going to spend money on things that have nothing to do with your project, then, you know, when we do the periodic audits and we see that, then we're going to have a problem. So, you know, if it's just say, like, for example, you had one person that was going to do something, you know, and that person didn't do it, and another person did it instead, and you're going to pay that other person instead, we wouldn't need approval for that. You would need to get approval for that. Or if, you know, you said you were going to buy a device from or software from Microsoft, and instead you bought it from somewhere else, that's fine, right? So any of those kind of changes that you make and it costs a little more, right? That's fine as long as it's within your total budget amount. That's fine. So we give you the discretion to like move things around within categories, but you know, if it's a big significant change between those two categories, then we want to know. For a project that spans two campuses, e.g. $30,000 proposal and a campus match, it would be split between the two campuses, correct? So that's actually a really good question. So at that point, it's really up to you, you know, where the match comes from. So, you know, that's something you're going to, first off, you're going to have one PI from one of the campuses, right? So there's no co-PI kind of situation. I mean, you have co-PIs, right? But there's going to be one kind of point person, contact person. And so you'll have to talk with the other person on their campus how you want to make that work. And it may work out that your campus just has more access to the in-kind resources to add to the proposal, to add to your budget. And that's fine. It doesn't have to be perfect 50-50.
Thanks, Chris. This is Andrew. I asked the question. I just wanted to confirm that it was a total 7,500 in that case contribution, however it's split between the campuses.
However it's split. Doesn't have to be split 50-50.
Thank you so much.
Yep. What's the guidance around citation for support in your project narrative? If we cite supporting literature as an evidence based in our project, so yeah. So here's what I recommend you do for that. we've actually had this question in the past. So the question is, you know, obviously this is an evidence-based, kind of program. We really want to have folks thinking about, you know, how they're going to assess it. And yes, having references is good. What we recommend you do, in lieu of actually including your references within the 2-page narrative, just like create a Google Doc and then put a link to that Google Doc within your narrative, so that, you know, folks can go out and look at those references outside of that 2-page limit. You know, we really want to make sure that all those are 2 pages. So no, you don't have to waste pages on your references. And definitely it's good practice to have, you know, literature referenced in your narrative, just link to those references outside of that. Okay. Great questions. Great questions. Yeah, Simone, that you did hear me correctly. So the $60,000 request of the campus match is on top of the $60,000. So if you're asking for $60,000, you're actually proposing a $90,000 project, because $30,000 has to come from campus match. And as I said earlier, if you're asking for a $30,000 project, you're asking for which is the max for the 25% match, you're actually asking for a $37,500 project. Sorry, Maureen, it started at noon. All right, so I got to the end of we'll get you the recording now. I got to the end of the questions in chat. Would anybody like to ask me a question? Happy to. I'll stop my share. Any questions? Here, Martin. All right, I'm just going to hang out, you know, just leave when you got to leave. But, you know, I know some of you probably have questions and don't want to ask in front of a group of all these people. So. Andrew, go ahead.
Hey, Chris. I'm still conceptualizing my project, but it involves multiple campuses, and it involves a PD component, and the collaborators that I've already talked to, of course, would be identified as collaborators in my project application. Is there an advantage to identifying more faculty participants? You know, i.e. those who would be participants in the project implementing the technology innovation, or I mean, this is one half dozen the other.
Yeah, well, I do think that you know, the more commitment you get from partners and collaborators, the better, right? So if you have people that you know are committed to participating in the project, and identifying those folks and what role they might play can only help. And so there's that project collaborators document. So, you know, the more people you have and the more specificity you have there, because it signals to the reviewers that, you know, you've talked to folks and that you have buy-in from others to it, and that they're committed to, you know, doing it. And that's sort of what we want to see, right? We really want folks doing that work prior to submitting a proposal, where they're, you know, trying to, you know, get, you know, but it may not be totally realistic to do that in some cases, where you're just going to have to wait.
But that's good to hear the general, that general
Yeah.
gist. And then I guess I just have one follow-up question also about collaborators. Is there a advantage or disadvantage, or is it possible to have a collaborator who's not a SUNY faculty member? So that's with the understanding that there are faculty members across a couple different campuses who are involved in the project, but say there's someone who's a national leader in X. Is that a good thing? Is it a possible thing? Or is that someone who I just work with, you know, someone who I've been brainstorming with? Yeah,
it's definitely, I mean, I think, you know, you'll have to obviously put it in context, right? I mean, and so, you know, for example, you know, we had this HighFlex project. There's this guy, Brian Beatty at San Francisco State, who's like the HighFlex guru, right? Like if
Yeah.
I proposed a HighFlex project to this open call, and I had him in my proposal and, paying him to do a workshop with the faculty across the SUNY campuses that we're doing, which is what we did, then, that would be totally legit, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
But, if you're asking for funding to pay someone who is outside of SUNY, who we could probably find somebody in SUNY, then that's not as ideal.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about the person as a paid, they've got their own bigger grants.
Yeah.
But maybe
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is,
yeah.
I don't know, but I guess the question is, would that person be a good person to list as a collaborator or not per se?
Hard to say. I mean,
Okay.
again, if that's somebody that could improve the successes, the chance of success for the project, then
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah,
Gotcha.
totally. And,
Okay.
yeah,
it's
and
not-
you'll just, yeah.
It's okay. It's meaning it's not a bad thing to have then.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the answer to a lot of these things are, it depends. and,
Yeah.
and can you make the case for it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
sure. No problem, Andrew. Steve.
Hey, Chris, I had
Hey.
a question about the Creative Commons licensing and that. So for our project, we are, if we submit, we're going to submit to create a virtual reality Google Cardboard app. And then obviously if possible, we would like to market that. I'm assuming that the Creative Commons license wouldn't preclude us from making that available in either a Google store or the App Store and charging for it, but we would also need to make that available with the Creative Commons license if people wanted to borrow our content and do it that way.
Yes, that's
Okay.
right. Yeah, no, there's no rule against creating something that you may want to put out there for others to pay you for, certainly. But it just, whatever's created utilizing IITG funds needs to have that Creative Commons license.
Okay, that's what I assumed. I just wanted to confirm.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yep, sure. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Some of you who are still here may have a question that you don't want recorded. So